Thank you very much. We're now resuming the second session of the National Summit to reassess the U.S.-Israel special relationship. Thank you all for still being here. And with this next panel, we'll be addressing specifically how the special relationship with Israel came about. I'm honored to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University and co-editor of the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs and the author of the Israel Lobby. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming to this important and timely gathering. I'm going to talk primarily about how things have changed since 2006. In 2006, almost 8 years ago, John Mearsheimer and I published an article in the London Review of Books entitled The Israel Lobby. By that summer, it had been downloaded about 300,000 times. It had generated a firestorm of criticism, including some intense personal attacks on John and myself. And although most of the criticisms were without foundation and the personal smears were predictable, by midsummer, the tide actually had begun to turn a bit. The journal Foreign Policy organized a symposium on the article, and by fall, we had a book contract. We wrote the article and we wrote the subsequent book because the Israel Lobby was a taboo subject that many people knew about, but hardly anybody talked about openly. And we wanted to challenge that taboo and open up a broader discussion. So again, I want to take the opportunity today to look back and reflect on what's changed since 2006. And to do that, first I'm going to summarize briefly what we said in the book and also what we didn't say. Second, I want to consider what's changed since 2006, but also what hasn't changed. And lastly, I want to offer some recommendations based on our experience. At this point, what course of action would I prescribe going forward? So what we said, our core arguments were actually very straightforward and not especially surprising. First, we argued there was a special relationship between the United States and Israel that was unlike any other bilateral relationship in American history. We gave it enormous economic, military, and diplomatic support and did so almost unconditionally. Moreover, Israel was largely immune from criticism by American politicians. In fact, American politicians routinely expressed a level of devotion they would never utter toward any other foreign country. Second, we argued you couldn't explain this on either strategic or moral grounds. Israel might have been a strategic asset during the Cold War, but the Cold War was over. It was increasingly a liability. The moral case was undermined by Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and especially by the occupation. Yet the special relationship kept getting deeper and deeper, and the question was why? Third, the answer was the political influence of the lobby. We defined the lobby as a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively worked to promote that special relationship. And those groups didn't agree on every issue, but all of them worked to convince American politicians to support Israel no matter what. We emphasized that these activities were in most respects no different than other interest groups like the NRA, the financial industry, the farm lobby, other ethnic lobbies. They just happened to be particularly good at it. And we showed in considerable detail how groups in the lobby worked within the political system to get sympathetic people elected or appointed to key positions, to keep those who might have different views out of power, and to pressure politicians to embrace their policy preferences. We also documented how individuals and groups in the lobby tried to control discourse on this subject by writing books and articles themselves, by funding think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, by putting pressure on other media organizations whenever they published or broadcast things that were critical of Israel or critical of the lobby. Some members of the lobby also tried to smear opponents, usually by accusing them of being anti-Semitic, even when this was completely false. Fifth, we argued that the special relationship and the other policies pushed by the lobby were not in the American national interest, or for that matter, in Israel's interest either. The lobby's influence made it impossible for the United States to be an honest broker. which is why American efforts to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had failed, and the settlements had grown steadily for more than 40 years. The lobby, and especially the neoconservatives within it, played a key role in convincing the Bush administration to invade Iraq in 2003. And the lobby had also worked to thwart any possible détente with Iran, a policy, by the way, that had failed to halt Iran's nuclear program, and it increased the risk of war. So we argued the United States should have a normal relationship with Israel, not a special relationship. We said the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival were at risk, but we should also use American leverage to get a two-state solution. And in fact, in the conclusion, we even suggested that a powerful pro-Israel lobby would be a good thing if it was supporting smarter policies that were in America's and Israel's interests. Now, we weren't saying anything that other writers hadn't said before, people such as Paul Finley, Edward Tivnan, George Ball, Michael Massing. What we wrote was also common knowledge inside the Beltway. Bill Clinton had said that AIPAC was, quote, better than anyone else lobbying in this town. Politicians as diverse as Lee Hamilton, Fritz Hollings, Barry Goldwater, Newt Gingrich, and Richard Gephardt had written or spoken about AIPAC's power in the past. Even passionate defenders of Israel, like Jeffrey Goldberg and Alan Dershowitz, had written proudly about the lobby's clout. Yet we provoked an extreme reaction, partly because we provided more detail about the lobby's influence, partly because we were both rather middle-of-the-road, boring figures from well-known universities, partly because we weren't left-wing, we weren't Muslim, we weren't Arab, we weren't married to Palestinians, and partly because it was obvious in the wake of 9/11 and the Iraq War that something had gone badly awry in U.S. Middle East policy. Now, let me turn now to what we didn't say. The rather hysterical reaction to our work confirmed one of our main points. It was very difficult to have a calm, reasoned, fact-based discussion on this topic, because most of our critics could not find fault with our logic or fault with our evidence. They accused us of saying many things we hadn't said, and in most cases things that were the exact opposite of what we had actually written. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the false accusations, but just for the record, here's what we didn't say. We didn't say that the Israel lobby was a cabal or a conspiracy, part of some deep plot to control the world. In fact, we said over and over it was nothing of the sort. It was an interest group like so many others here. We did not question Israel's legitimacy or right to exist. On the contrary, we explicitly defended it. Third, we didn't blame Israel for all the problems that trouble the Middle East, and we didn't say that a normal relationship with Israel and a two-state solution would immediately solve all of them. We said it would help, but it wasn't a magic bullet or anything like that. We did not say the lobby controlled every aspect of U.S. Middle East policy or argue that it was the only reason the United States invaded Iraq or has a bad relationship with Iran. We didn't accuse members of the lobby of disloyalty, and we neither argued nor hinted that something should be done to limit the lobby's political power or marginalize its supporters. Finally, we did not connect Israel or the lobby to the 9/11 attacks themselves. We didn't say any of these things because we didn't think they were true, right? And that's important. We were accused of saying all those things, of course, and people in the lobby made repeated and sometimes successful efforts to silence us. Virtually every place we were invited to speak told us that they had been pressured to cancel our appearances, and a number of places, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Google headquarters, the City University of New York, succumbed to this pressure. But the campaign to silence us failed. The book sold well. It's been translated into over 20 languages, and John and I have remained active participants in the debate on this and other foreign policy issues. But the real question is, what impact did any of this have? What's changed and what hasn't? I think the most dramatic and obvious change since 2006 has been an opening up of discourse on this general topic. Discussions of Middle East policy and U.S.-Israeli relations are more open. A wider range of views is now being expressed. Let me just give you some of the evidence behind this claim. Media figures such as Tom Friedman, Nick Kristof, Roger Cohen, and Andrew Sullivan now write openly and at times very critically about Israeli policy, about American support for that policy, and the lobby's role in promoting it. Even Jeff Goldberg has written a couple of pieces that sound a bit like us, although I doubt he'd admit it. Articles about American Middle East policy more generally increasingly mention AIPAC's influence. It's just no longer a big secret or stuck in the background of the piece. Jon Stewart, if you watch Comedy Central at all, Jon Stewart has done a number of segments making fun of AIPAC as well. Books like Peter Beinart's Crisis of Zionism, Dan Fleshler's Transforming America's Israel Lobby, John Judas's recent Genesis have followed in our footsteps, documented the role the lobby plays in driving U.S. policy. Other people like M.J. Rosenberg have emerged as articulate and knowledgeable critics. Writers like Max Blumenthal have published critical accounts of anti-democratic trends in Israel itself. Websites like Mondoweiss, Muzzlewatch, Electronic Intifada, and others now provide alternative perspectives. And groups like J Street, Jewish Voice for Peace, Code Pink, Americans for Peace Now, and many others have become more visible and effective in presenting an alternative view to the traditional lobby organizations. Now note, these groups are not homogeneous. They don't all agree on every single issue. My point is simply that there is a much wider range of views out there now, and they are getting noticed. This development is, of course, not entirely our doing, because a number of events in the real world have made the lobby's power hard to miss. The complete failure of Barack Obama's push for a two-state solution and a settlement freeze in his first term. The craven American response to Operation Cast Lead, including the American trashing of the Goldstone report. The spectacle of the 2012 election, when the GOP candidates looked like fools trying to out-pander each other in the GOP primary season, and where Sheldon Adelson spent $100 million trying to buy the election, first for Newt Gingrich and then for Mitt Romney. Because discourse was more open and people were now aware of the role of the lobby, more people noticed these things and could put two and two together. A second development, the accusation of anti-Semitism is losing its power to intimidate. And let me be very clear about this. Like all forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism is a despicable practice. Every one of us should condemn it whenever it appears. At the same time, using false charges of anti-Semitism to stifle debate and destroy people's reputations is an ugly tactic that has no place in a democracy, and people who use it in that way should also be called to account. And I think fortunately, this tactic has been so overused and used against so many people who are obviously not anti-Semites, that it's no longer able to stifle reasonable discussion. And that's going to make it easier to have an honest conversation going forward. The third change is that some of the policies the lobby has promoted are increasingly hard to defend. Instead of a weak Israeli David surrounded by a hostile Arab Goliath, we have a powerful, nuclear-armed Israel maintaining a brutal occupation for more than 4 decades, using its military power to dominate a Palestinian population denied political rights. Fourth, AIPAC and other groups in the lobby have lost several important fights in recent years. They could not convince the Bush administration to use force against Iran or support an Israeli attack on Iran. They could not derail the nomination of Chuck Hagel to be Secretary of Defense, although some hardline groups tried to do so in especially ugly ways. Earlier this year, they could not convince Obama to bomb Syria. And more recently, AIPAC could not get the Senate to pass a resolution threatening greater economic sanctions on Iran because it was widely recognized this would immediately derail any possibility of a diplomatic deal. These episodes remind us that the lobby does not control U.S. Middle East policy, does not get every single thing it wants, especially when what it wants might push the United States closer to war. That's a lot for any lobby to ask for, And it takes very special circumstances to pull something like that off. Those events, I think, also tell us that AIPAC and company are not invincible. Now, those setbacks have led a number of observers to conclude that AIPAC's in deep trouble, that the lobby's influence has been broken. Let me say why I think that is premature, because there are a number of things that haven't changed. First of all, the special relationship is still intact. We still give generous economic and military assistance, even though Israel's a wealthy country and has clear military superiority over its neighbors. And we give this aid unconditionally. There's no hint we might reduce our assistance to get Israel to stop building settlements or to allow creation of a viable Palestinian state. Second, that's of course why the peace process continues to go nowhere. Remember, Obama came into office promising a two-state solution in his first term and called for a settlement freeze in his famous Cairo speech in June 2009. He's been in steadfast retreat ever since. He basically gave up on this in the first term and handed the problem over to John Kerry. But there's little evidence that Kerry's efforts are going to succeed. The settlements have been expanding all the while. Notice, by the way, that a two-state solution may well be impossible at this point, but politicians in the District of Columbia continue to pretend that it is the only American goal. Now, I'm a two-state person myself, but I'm also a realist, and at some point one does have to at least start acknowledging the possibility that we're not going to get a two-state solution. Third, the lobby still gets enormous deference from American politicians. A few weeks ago, the left-wing progressive mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, was recorded telling an AIPAC group that defending Israel was part of his job description as mayor of New York. If you were paying attention, earlier this week, a number of prominent American politicians, including Secretary of State Kerry, Nancy Pelosi, and John McCain all gave the usual flowery speeches at the AIPAC policy conference. And even today, there's really no other lobbying group that gets this kind of deference and attention here in Washington. Fourth, although discourse is more open now, it is still, I think, extremely risky for young, ambitious foreign policy wannabes to question key elements of U.S. Middle East policy, and especially the special relationship. You can if you have tenure at a university, if you don't have your heart set on working in the U.S. government, or if you're retired. But it's hard to find people inside the foreign policy establishment who are willing to say what they think on this issue out loud. Just look at how Chuck Hagel and Samantha Power had to contort themselves during their confirmation hearings, and you see the lobby's continued influence. And please don't forget that we're still a long way from a deal with Iran or a two-state solution, and the lobby will be working 24/7 to make sure that the United States doesn't do anything Israel doesn't want. In short, reports of the lobby's demise have been greatly exaggerated, and given that fact, what do I think we ought to do about it? I'll just give you, I think, 4 basic lessons here. Lesson number 1, it's just politics, stupid. The first lesson I would emphasize is this is all about politics. The Israel lobby is powerful because it has all the features that make an interest group powerful. And it uses all the tools available in a democracy: direct lobbying, financial contributions, grassroots organizing, pressure on the media, etc. There is nothing magical, nothing conspiratorial about this. They're also influential because they haven't faced strong and well-organized opposition. And if they are facing greater headwinds today, say on Iran, it's because others are starting to play that political game more effectively. Lesson number 2, it's going to get worse before it gets better. The lobby's main goal is protecting the special relationship, and that's going to be harder to do as Israel moves rightward and as it becomes obvious that there's not going to be a two-state solution. Israel's control over the West Bank will be recognized more and more as apartheid. Pressure to give the Palestinians political rights is going to grow. One person, one vote is easy for Americans to understand. And if you saw the recent poll by Shibli Telhami, that's what Americans overwhelmingly favor if they believe a two-state solution is no longer possible. Then they favor one-state democracy. Getting the United States to back a state that privileges one ethnic or religious group over others is going to be an increasingly hard sell over time. And to try and make that sell, groups like AIPAC are going to have to do even more to try and influence discourse, to try and discredit critics. But in my estimation, the more strident and heavy-handed their tactics are, the more resentment it will sow, and the more people will be turned off over time. Lesson number 3, be realistic and build a big tent. Reversing policies that have been in place for decades does not happen overnight, and you don't do it by writing a single article or a single book. What one needs is a big tent for people who want a normal relationship with Israel and a Middle East policy that conforms to a broad conception of the American national interest. That doesn't mean that everybody in this room has to agree on everything. The Israel lobby is a loose coalition united by a couple of shared goals, and we should take a page from their playbook, while making sure that our ranks are not filled with those who sow hatred or spread discredited conspiracy theories. Lastly, if we were to write the book today, how might it be different? Well, it would have to be a lot longer because a lot of new information has come to light since 2007, and you could even argue that the entire Obama administration is a case study of the lobby's continued influence. So, we'd have to do volume 2, and it would have to be just as long as the first edition was. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think John or I would change our central arguments at all, because events since 2006, 2007 have vindicated almost all of what we wrote. To repeat, we wrote the book to encourage a more open discussion of these issues, because we thought a more open debate would bring a lot of additional truths to light and would be better for everybody in the end. Now, I think that's precisely what has happened, though, again, we do not take all the credit for it. So I just want to close by thanking those of you who have worked for many years, long before we got into this, to counter the lobby's arguments and hasten the day when the American relationship with Israel is guided primarily by strategic interests and moral principles and not by domestic politics. When that day arrives, it's going to be better for us, but also better for Israel and also for its neighbors as well. Thank you very much.
Next we have Dr. Jeffrey Warrow, Director of the Military History Center at the University of North Texas and a professor of history at the university, and he was formerly professor of strategic studies at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Warrow.
Thank you. Well, the book, Quicksand, it treats a lot of themes: imperialism, wars, terrorism, oil. But as regards the U.S.-Israeli relationship, I charted the process using U.S. and British archives through which we became engaged and allied with Israel from the Balfour Declaration until the Obama presidency. The book was published in 2010. Well, in the beginning, there was Woodrow Wilson. He assented to the Balfour Declaration under political pressure from Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was the American-born son of Czech Jews and president of the American Committee for Zionist Affairs. Now, Wilson initially opposed the Balfour Declaration because it contravened his own 14 points, particularly his emphasis on national self-determination. And Wilson, of course, had sent a commission roving around the Middle East in 1919, the King Crane Commission, which surveyed 260 communities in Palestine, none of which wanted Jewish settlers or European powers defining their affairs. They wanted to become an American mandate because they rather naively said the U.S. would never let anybody else run our affairs. They would insist on majority rule. But Louis Brandeis showed Wilson that he'd gained politically by supporting a Jewish state. Between 1900 and 1914, 100,000 European Jewish immigrants had entered the U.S. every year and settled in compact pockets in crucial cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Cleveland, Cincinnati. And anyone who wanted to dominate the Electoral College needed these places. Well, as the Second World War wound down, FDR struggled with the question of Palestine. The depression of the 1930s and then the war and its aftermath had unleashed a flood of first Jewish settlers, then refugees and displaced persons, increasing the Jewish population of Palestine from a very small amount to 30% of the total by 1945. Now, FDR didn't worry about Palestine all that much because he had much bigger things to worry about at the time, but he worried about Palestine because the king of Saudi Arabia worried about Palestine. And FDR was planning to make the kingdom America's strategic oil reserve after the war. And he met with King Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy in Great Bitter Lake in the Suez Canal as he was returning for Yalta. And one of the things that FDR said after was, I can't understand why he keeps going back to the subject of Palestine. At the same time, FDR was reminded by the Zionist Review, a New York paper in 1945, that tilting toward the Palestinians to appease the Saudis would be political suicide in America. The Zionist Review wrote, New York is entitled to 47 electoral votes, while only 266 electoral votes are necessary to elect a president. Whether the state of New York goes to one party or the other, by relatively few votes in a tightly contested race, will make a difference of 94 votes in the Electoral College. Now, end quote. The same dynamic prevailed in the other key battleground states of the time, which were New York, Ohio, Illinois, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. The paper continued, they may swing to one party or the other by only a few thousand votes, and 90% of the Jewish population of the United States is concentrated in these doubtful states. End quote. Truman got the message, loud and clear. His Secretary of State, Burns, and then Marshall, and his Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, were monitored and channeled by Eddie Jacobson, David Niles, and Max Lowenthal, whom they called the backroom boys in the White House. George Marshall, trying to build a big Cold War coalition around the world and convinced that strong support for Israel would only weaken the coalition, rued, as he put it, the squalid political purposes of these backroom boys. For their part, Niles and Lowenthal scorned the striped pants boys in the State Department and the Defense Department and showed Truman the math. There are 5 million Jews in America, a 20-fold increase since the 1880s. They're organized in pressure groups like the Federation of American Zionists, the American Jewish Committee, and they vote. The backroom boys demanded a house cleaning at State, an appointment of somebody who's really trustworthy on Palestine matters. People at State are really bitching things up, Niles wrote Lowenthal. Well, President Truman agreed, saying to critics like Marshall and Forrestal, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I don't have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents. He took the Palestine portfolio away from Loy Henderson's Near Eastern desk and gave it to Clark Clifford, Niles, and Lowenthal. It would henceforth be managed for its domestic political dividends. Strategy be damned. Loy Henderson, dismissed as too Arabist by the Zionist lobby, was then sent off to be ambassador to India. Marshall rebelled, telling the president that he was weakening the U.S. globally by his uncritical support for the Zionists. Marshall and Henderson were for an Arab state in Palestine with guarantees for a Jewish minority. Truman and the backroom boys wanted partition, with the very best areas, 55% of the total landmass, to the Jews, which would, of course, inflame the Arabs and imperil any Cold War coalition against the Soviets. U.S. policy, Marshall scolded the president, has to be based on U.S. national interests and not on your domestic political considerations. 3 days before the British scuttle from Palestine in '48, Marshall spoke the sharpest rebuke ever delivered to a president in the Oval Office when he told Truman that he was putting the great office of the president at risk by so tamely supporting the Zionists against the Arab majority of Palestine. The president, Marshall said, was subordinating an international crisis to a transparent dodge to win a few votes. Marshall's deputy called the emerging state of Israel a pig in a poke, a state with high strategic costs and few apparent benefits. Well, in the 1948 presidential election, Tom Dewey, projected to be the winner right up until Election Day, had a stout pro-Israel plank in his platform, and Truman felt he could do no less. He pledged full recognition and development aid to a Jewish state despite its relatively small numbers, half as many Jews in Palestine at the time as Arabs, and tolerated Israel's brutal expulsion of 75% of Palestine's Arab inhabitants in the 1948 war, creating the 844,000 Palestinian refugees, whose number has grown to 5 million today. The 1948 war Israel's expulsion or liquidation of the Palestinians and the assassination of Count Folke Bernadotte internationalized the Palestinian question to America's great disadvantage. Now all Arab governments in the region took this Palestinian question as their touchstone and made it sort of the focus of all their relations with America. President Eisenhower, who vowed to downgrade Israel to improve America's total situation in the Middle East, also keeled over under the lobbying pressure at home. There are 5 million Jewish voters in the U.S., he sighed, and very few Arabs. Before the 1956 Suez War, Secretary of State Dulles had warned the Israelis that they must make substantial concessions on borders and refugees to improve the security and continued existence of the free world. After the war, when Ike forced Israel to disgorge Sinai and Gaza, the Israelis used that concession to foreclose, forever apparently, all talk of whittling down the 1949 borders or compensating refugees, which is the situation that prevails to this day. Senators of both parties, Johnson, Humphrey, Noland, piled on for short-term political advantage in 1956, decrying the, quote, Dulles-Eisenhower policy of squeezing Israel and appeasing the Arabs, unquote, the same senseless rhetoric that prevails today. The British ambassador in Washington was astonished by this. The Americans, he wrote, crave oil and strategic space in the Cold War, but they refused to coax the concessions from the Israelis that would lodge them more securely in that space. Tel Aviv, meanwhile, demands and gets an American security guarantee of their borders without any sacrifice at all, unquote. Well, that ambassador, Harold Katcha, advised Dulles to sell the security guarantee to Israel for a usable price, land or refugees. But Dulles replied that he couldn't, saying, with Israeli pressure and elections coming on, I can't any longer refrain from offering Israel guarantees, arms, and even a defense pact. Dulles cited political factors as well as, quote, the terrific control the Jews have over the U.S. media, unquote. To his disbelieving government in London, Katcha reported the Americans are going to guarantee Israeli frontiers without any sacrifice at all on Israel's part, as we still do today. It made and makes no strategic sense whatsoever. In 1962, JFK had his own stab at a peace process. He tried to pressure Israel into accepting the Carnegie Endowment's Johnson Plan, which would resettle in Israel or cash compensate Palestine's Arab refugees, whose number had now grown to 1.3 million. Kennedy was dissuaded by his White House desk officer for Israel, a man named Meyer Feldman, whose new position reflected the immense growing power of Israel in U.S. decision-making. Feldman said, disengage from this plan, Mr. President, or there's going to be a violent eruption domestically and in our relations with Israel. JFK not only disengaged, he rewarded Israel with aid dollars, early warning radars, and Hawk SAMs, punching a hole in the U.S. embargo on the sale of major weapons systems to the Middle East that had been maintained until that time. With characteristic fearlessness, the Israelis deployed the Hawks around their Dimona nuclear weapons facility as if to mock Kennedy's efforts to shut it down. Well, the 1962 Hawk sale, followed by Skyhawks in '66 and Phantoms in '68, set the precedent that created the U.S.-Israeli strategic relationship, a multi-billion-dollar business in cutting-edge weaponry, supplemented by military-to-military dialogues, joint exercises, and cooperative R&D. That multi-billion-dollar business has engaged the defense industry and its dependent congressmen in the already robust Israel lobby. Thus it was that shortly before Kennedy's death, the President, during meetings with Golda Meir in Palm Beach, characterized the U.S.-Israeli alliance as no less intimate than our special relationship with Great Britain. Privately, however, Kennedy deplored Israeli policies, which had spawned, as he called it, a Palestinian liberation movement, Fatah and the PLO, which had now become the rallying cry of every Arab government in the region, vastly complicating U.S. initiatives and strategy in the Middle East. LBJ, of course, paid little attention to the Middle East. Everything to do with the Middle East must be subject to events in Southeast Asia, as his Secretary of State, Dean Russ, said. When he did pay attention, he viewed the region like Truman, a place where he could win Jewish votes in U.S. elections. I've got 3 cones in my cabinet, LBJ said. No one's going to do more for Israel than I will. In 1965, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Wally Barber, warned that the IDF, which now towered technologically and organizationally over all of its Arab rivals, must be prevented from making any new annexations. Such annexations, Barber argued in 1965, would do incalculable long-term damage to U.S. interests. If Israel attacks, the U.S. is going to have to impose merciless sanctions. It's not enough to contain the Arabs, Barber said. We have to contain both sides. Well, in the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, quadrupled its territory, and created 300,000 new refugees alongside the 1.7 million old ones. Far from sanctioning Israel for the annexations or the attack on the USS Liberty, Johnson sat on his hands, entrenching the forever war still sputtering in Israel and the occupied territories. Instead of rolling back the Israeli annexations, as Ike had done in 1956, Johnson approved them, as well as the sale of F-4 Phantoms to Israel, merely commenting that American Jews want LBJ to send the Sixth Fleet to the Gulf of Aqaba, but they won't send a goddamn screwdriver to Vietnam. Under attack by RFK and Eugene McCarthy for the 68 nomination, LBJ didn't dare alienate the lobby. From LBJ on, every president tolerated illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, a process Rabin called redeeming Israel's narrow hips. And the hips were narrow, of course, because despite Israeli efforts to evict the Palestinians annexed in 1967, most of them had stayed put, increasing Israel's Arab population from 200,000 to 1 million. Well, U.S. pressure on Moscow in the 70s, I just have a little bit more to get through here, I hope you'll indulge me, was aimed by pro-Israel hawks like Scoop Jackson at filling up the West Bank, the Golan, and Gaza settlements with Russian Jews. 40,000 immigrants a year and $35 million a year in expenditures, enabled by U.S. aid dollars, created new facts on the ground that we deal with today. We disagree with this policy, Kissinger aide Joseph Sisko wrote in 1971, but we say nothing, so the Israelis assume our acquiescence. Nixon called the failure of his predecessors to solve the Palestinian land and refugee problems one of the major lapses of the post-World War II era. His first Secretary of State, William Rogers, the first diplomat to use the term Palestinian instead of the Israeli-favored term refugee, tried to roll back the Israelis but was immediately stymied by Golda Meir, who drove a wedge between the friendly U.S. government of Nixon and the hostile State Department of Rogers, another tried and true Israeli gambit. Kissinger fared no better than Rogers. He threw away Washington's best opportunity to wring major game-changing concessions from Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. With Israel on the defensive, Nixon and Kissinger authorized a massive airlift to Tel Aviv. Instead of trading weapons in support for Israeli concessions on land and refugees, the course actually advised by Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, they gullibly assumed that Israeli gratitude for rescue would result in concessions after the war. There wouldn't be any concessions. Before the war even ended, Nixon realized his error. He'd made the Israelis, as he put it, quote, more difficult to deal with than ever before, unquote. During the crisis, Schlesinger, who had asked a principals meeting the following question: is there a difference between defending Israel and defending Israel's conquests? Everyone in the room said yes. Well then, Schlesinger said, we should only ship the Israelis consumables, fuel and ammunition, and hold back the planes and the tanks until after the war, when we can use these as levers to pry the Israelis out of the occupied territories. Smart guy. Kissinger assumed that he was smarter. He said, no, if we kick the Israelis in the teeth, notice the language, if we kick the Israelis in the teeth over this, they'll never listen to us again. Makes no sense. And Kissinger, clearly a very smart guy. I don't know what was ailing him at the time. Kissinger assured Nixon that he'd be able to manage the Israelis. Of course, he wasn't. They crossed the Golan Heights, they crossed the Suez Canal, provoking a major Cold War crisis. They can't do this to us again, Henry Nixon wailed. They've done it to us for 4 years, but no more, as if. Nixon, pushed by key senators like Humphrey, Kennedy, Javits, Jackson, Church, Cranston, and Bai, some of whom were planning to run for president in '76, paradoxically rewarded Israeli intransigence after the war with $2.2 billion in new military aid. Nixon and Kissinger reinforced the Kennedy tendency. We must let Israel use weapons to produce security. It seemed that the only way to manage the Israelis in a U.S. political environment that made real negotiation or sanctions impossible was to give them more stuff, arms and money, and merely hope that they'd give a little to get more. A point made very well by Steve Wald and John Mearsheimer in their book. Well, quicksand follows this thread through to the present day. the U.S.-Israeli relationship continues with the same tail wags dog quality described above. And so we arrive at today an Obama administration that has burnt its fingers every time it approaches the issue of a peace settlement. The portfolio has been transferred to John Kerry, whose tremendous ambition and energy, I suspect, is going to be insufficient to arrange a settlement that Israel has become so proficient at resisting. If there is to be a final settlement, as Netanyahu hinted at AIPAC earlier this week, it will be less from American diplomatic pressure, which the Israelis routinely ignore, and more from Israeli fears of the BDS movement, and from their calculation that with the Middle East splintered, they might be able to join a large Sunni coalition against Iran and its clients. A Palestinian state would be the precondition for such a diplomatic revolution. And yet, in view of the history I've just described, I, for one, am not holding my breath. Thank you very much.
Next speaking will be Professor John Quigley, Professor of Law at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, and author of a number of excellent books on this issue. I believe he will be signing some books afterwards, as will some of the other speakers.
Good. Thank you, Allison. The special relationship has a very significant impact in terms of the positions that the United States takes on the key legal issues involved in the conflict. And in general, I think one can say that our positions are out of step with the positions of most of the world community, and that it's one of the major reasons for the negative perception of the United States in the region that you've heard about this morning. So I want to go through a number of key legal issues. The first I'll mention, and on this one I think the administration is not quite as negative as you'll find me saying on the others, relates to the status of Jerusalem. The Congress passed a law a couple of years ago to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. The president, successive presidents now, have resisted doing that. We have a consulate general in Jerusalem, which reports directly to the State Department. It has not been put under the embassy in Tel Aviv. So as a technical matter, the executive branch has preserved the position that the status of Jerusalem is not determined, and we have not given in to the Israeli position on that. Similarly, with respect to the question of passports, Congress passed a law in 2002 saying that a person born in Jerusalem who would become a U.S. citizen had the right, if in being issued a U.S. passport, to have Israel placed in the little box as to place of birth. The administration has resisted that and has refused to comply with that. This went to court. It was decided quite recently here in the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit that it is within the power of the president to decide on issues of diplomatic recognition, and therefore it was within the power of the president to refuse to apply that act. Okay, so that's the good news. That took about 35 seconds. The question of territory is a bit bleaker. You heard this morning some references to the 1967 war, and this is one on which the United States, should have been taking the view that President Eisenhower took in 1956 when the war broke out in 1967, but it didn't. And I think we're living with the consequences of that to this day. The background of the war, I think, was accurately mentioned, if briefly, by General David this morning, that it was an attack by Israel. It's commonly thought that Israel justified the attack as anticipatory self-defense, that is, that Egypt was going to attack. In fact, that's not what it said in the Security Council. What it said in the Security Council was that Egypt had in fact attacked Israel on the morning of June 5th, and the Israeli military action was a response to that. That was the position of Abba Eban all through the discussions in the Security Council in June of 1967. It was, of course, a story that had been invented because at a certain point, the Israeli high command realized that the Egyptian army was overextended in the troops that it had brought up to the border, and that they had a pretty good chance of destroying the Egyptian army if they attacked. And that's essentially what they did. And they were in discussion with the Johnson administration for about 2 weeks prior to June 5th, 1967. Abba Eban made repeated communications and entreaties to the Johnson administration saying, you know, we think that the Egyptians are going to attack, and the Johnson administration kept responding by saying, no, it's not true. And the CIA was analyzing on a daily basis and kept telling the administration, I think accurately, that there was no indication that Egypt was about to attack. Egypt was concerned that Israel was threatening Syria, and it wanted to deter an attack by Israel on Syria. Okay, but that discussion eventually just came to a kind of a standoff. But Johnson was fairly strong in telling Israel not to attack Egypt. Finally, the Israelis gave up on Abba Eban, and they sent Meir Amit, the head of Mossad, to come to Washington to put it to the administration a different way. He didn't say, please support us if we attack. He said, you know, we're going to attack. What are you going to do? And the response he got from a number of administration officials led him to believe that the U.S. government would keep quiet. That is, it wouldn't do a repeat of what Eisenhower did in 1956, and that it would let Israel essentially get away with it if it were able to be done relatively quickly. Meir Amit went back and had a meeting at Levi Eshkol's house on the night of the 3rd of June, 1967, and what he told Levi Eshkol as to his impression of the Johnson administration and what it would do if Israel went ahead and attacked, he said, they will not sit Shiva. Meaning that they will not mourn. They will not be unhappy if we do it. And he was right. When it happened, the administration immediately knew that the story that was being told by Abba Eban was false, but they decided to keep quiet about it. And I think we're living with that ever since. After about, by early July, the Israeli government stopped saying that Egypt had attacked. Levi Eshkol gave a press conference and was asked about the war, and that's when he said, well, Egypt was going to attack us, and that's why we had to attack. So they implicitly, acknowledged that the story had been false. But this story about their having been under threat it really took hold, and that, of course, is the dominant Israeli version now of the war. And if you look at justifications that were given in maybe a decade ago now for the Bush Doctrine, when that was being discussed, the new policy about preemptive use of force for the United States, those who tried to write theoretical justifications for that doctrine fished around to find precedents for it. And the only one they found was the 1967 war, which of course was a false precedent, but that was the only precedent they could find in recent state practice for the proposition that it's okay to invade in substantial anticipation, let's say, of an attack against an attack that is anticipated but is not close to being immediate. So on this issue, I think the administration is quite deficient, and that holds true to the present. I mean, if you ask the administration now who was responsible for the 1967 war, they're not going to give you a straight story on it. The other major issue is the question of Palestine's status and whether Palestine is a state, the whole issue that's come up before the General Assembly of the UN and in the Security Council, in particular with the application for admission to the UN that was filed in 2011 by the government of Palestine. And of course, as you're aware, the United States kind of killed that in the Security Council and kept it from coming to a vote. The Palestine government subsequently applied for admission to UNESCO, which is a UN specialized agency, and membership is open only to a state. And there was no veto possibility, and it passed. So Palestine was admitted as a state to UNESCO, and then more recently went in 2012 to the General Assembly of the UN for a statement, essentially, that Palestine is a state, and that passed. It passed, I think it was 139 votes in favor, and there are actually other states that abstained on that resolution but have diplomatic relations with Palestine. If you add that number to the number that voted in favor of that resolution, you get somewhere around, I think it's 158 states that have accepted Palestine as a state. The United States resists that. And says, well, Palestine can't be a state until it negotiates that with Israel, which doesn't make a great deal of sense to me, and isn't an accurate reflection of international practice about statehood. I mean, when you get 158 states saying that another entity is a state, that's pretty strong. When this resolution was adopted in the General Assembly, and this is November of 2012, Susan Rice spoke in explanation of vote for the United States. The United States voted, voted against the resolution. And she said, today's voting should not be misconstrued by any as constituting eligibility for United Nations membership. It does not. The resolution does not establish that Palestine is a state. Well, the resolution says that Palestine is a state. As a technical matter, she may be true. The General Assembly resolutions are not legislative in character. But with respect to statehood, what's critical is an entity's acceptance by the existing states of the world. And here you clearly have it. It goes back, in fact, to 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne, the treaty that set up Iraq and Palestine and Syria as states. If you look at that treaty, it refers to those three entities as being states detached from the Ottoman Empire. So the international community accepted those as states going back that far. The issue of settlements, another one on which the United States position has been very uncertain, let's say. You had analysis of this during the Carter administration, where the legal advisor came out very strongly, saying that the settlements are illegal under the Geneva Convention of 1949. And then you had President Reagan coming in and saying something, well, we're not sure about that, but they're an obstacle to peace, but from that time, there wasn't much discussion of the legality of settlements. And when the bilateral process started in the mid-90s, the United States took the position in the Security Council that it would not support any Security Council resolutions critical of Israel, in particular on settlements. So as a result, it began vetoing resolutions that were critical of Israel on settlement constructions, in particular around Jerusalem. But more recently, when Ms. Clinton was Secretary of State, she began referring to new settlements as being illegal, which implied that the prior settlements were okay. Now we get a statement, this is now November of last year, from Secretary Kerry, who says settlements are illegitimate. They've backed off the word illegal. I'm not sure what distinction they see between illegal and illegitimate. And he wasn't all that clear. He made the statement in a way that it might have applied to prior settlements, but still it's very ambiguous. And this is, of course, against the very strong opinion of the world community on the question of settlements. The United States has also pressured the Palestine government not to go to the International Criminal Court, which would be a way of dealing with the settlements. And to my mind, the only way within legal principle that the settlements can presently be dealt with, since negotiation and pressure from the United States doesn't seem to be very effective. But the International Criminal Court statute defines war crimes. One of the war crimes, a long list of things defined as war crimes, one of them is transferring civilians into territory under belligerent occupation. So it's a slam dunk with respect to the settlements in the West Bank. And that, I think, actually should be pursued by the International Criminal Court, even without any further action on the part of the government of Palestine, but on the basis of the conferment of jurisdiction that Palestine did to in 2009 after the Gaza War, when it filed a statement with the International Criminal Court saying that it conferred jurisdiction for any war crimes or genocide, whether crimes against humanity committed in the territory of Palestine. And the prosecutor should be able to work simply on that basis and go ahead and investigate. Unfortunately, the prosecutor first said, well, I'm not sure whether Palestine is a state, so I was a bit mystified by that. So I sent him an email in March of 2009. I said, well, you know, by the way, Palestine is a state, and you have every basis for this. And eventually other people started sending him memos in the other direction. So eventually he invited all of us to come to The Hague and argue it out. And we went, and Dory Gold came and argued against jurisdiction. And eventually, unfortunately, the prosecutor's office decided that it was not its position to make a determination as to whether Palestine was a state. This is after 3 years of saying it was struggling with the issue. It decided that it was not its position. And that, in fact, is what led the Palestine government to go to the General Assembly and get the resolution adopted in November of 2012. But there's also the question of repatriation of the refugees from 1948. I'll just finish with that. Here, the United States position used to be very strong. If you look at the proceedings of the UN General Assembly in December of 1948, when the resolution was being adopted calling on Israel to repatriate, Dean Rusk was representing the United States, and he stood up and made a speech. And he said that the refugees should not be pawns of a political settlement. The position of Ben-Gurion at the time was, we will deal with the refugee issue when and if we get recognition from the Arab states. And Dean Rusk was saying, no, this is a humanitarian issue. It needs to be dealt with. And the United States voted in favor of General Assembly Resolution 194 that was adopted then, and every year thereafter, when it was reiterated by the General Assembly, up until the mid-90s, the United States voted in favor of those reiterations of General Assembly Resolution 194, and then we stopped. And now, of course, Israel has a peace agreement with Egypt. It has a peace agreement with Jordan, and it's a negotiating agreement with Israel. So Ben-Gurion's rationale, if that was the real rationale, would mean that Israel should be prepared to accept all the refugees back. But this is not being pressed by the United States in the negotiations, not at all. At Camp David in the year 2000, President Clinton really didn't take the repatriation question very seriously. Mr. Kerry apparently has suggested that maybe 80,000 should be taken back. That's a rumor, but clearly we're not taking a strong position. Thank you.
I'm Allison Weir, President of the Council for the National Interest and Executive Director of If Americans Knew. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. There are full citations in my book for everything that I'll be saying, and some of it will be quite surprising, so I want you to look at the citations if you'd like. For most of my life, I knew very little about Israel-Palestine. I was deeply aware of the Nazi Holocaust, sympathetic to Israel, and had seen the movie Exodus. But then in fall of 2000, the departure of my youngest child for college coincided with the eruption of the Second Palestinian Intifada, with its images of children throwing stones against tanks. And I finally began to pay attention to a distant part of the world that I had thought had little to do with me and my family. When I paid attention, I noticed how one-sided the news coverage seemed to be, providing far more information from and about Israelis than Palestinians. Growing curious, I looked into what the internet had to offer and discovered a wealth of information directly from the region, from Palestinians, Israelis, and others, that revealed a far darker reality than our media were reporting. A reality in which Israel's massively powerful military, it appeared, was using extreme violence against a population that was largely unarmed, killing many and injuring multitudes. The strategy, I read in a report by an Israeli academic, was to keep deaths below the level that would trigger world outrage, while maiming as many as possible. A common practice was for Israeli snipers to target knees and eyes. In the first month alone, over 7,000 Palestinians were injured, including numerous children. I noticed little of this was being reported by one of my main news sources, NPR's Linda Gradstein, and I began to notice a pattern of media filtration that continues through today, in which some facts are repeated and some never reported. While we repeatedly are told that rockets are fired from Gaza into Israel, we seem never to be told that in the over 10 years of largely homemade rocket fire has killed a total of 29 Israelis. Nor do we learn that during this same period, Israeli forces have killed 4,000 Gazans. We tend to hear, often in detail, about Israeli children who have been tragically killed. We hear far less often about the Palestinian children who were killed first and in far greater numbers. It is my view that all of these deaths are tragic. After several months of researching such information, I finally decided I needed to go and see for myself if things were truly as bad as I was beginning to believe. I quit my job as a small-town weekly newspaper editor and traveled over to the region as a freelance reporter, traveling throughout the West Bank and Gaza in February and March of 2001, long before rocket fire from Gaza, and took photographs of what I saw. When I returned, I began an organization to tell Americans the facts on this issue. I also began to study it intensely. I was especially curious about the U.S. connection, reading book after book by respected authors and scholars. I was completely unprepared for what I found. I discovered an extraordinarily powerful and pervasive special interest lobby of which I had previously been almost entirely unaware. Even more surprising, I discovered that this was just the latest incarnation of a movement that has been active in the United States for over a century. A movement called political Zionism, its adherents are called Zionists, that has profoundly impacted my nation and others, and yet that many Americans do not even know exists. I discovered that political Zionism, a movement to create a Jewish state in Palestine, had begun in the late 1800s. And that by the early 1890s, there were organizations promoting this ideology in New York, Chicago, Baltimore, Milwaukee, Boston, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. By the 1910s, the number of Zionists in the U.S. approached 20,000 and included lawyers, professors, and businessmen, and was becoming a movement to which, as one historian put it, congressmen, particularly in the eastern cities, began to listen. That was the 1910s. By 1918, there were 200,000 Zionists in the U.S., and in 1948, there were nearly 1 million. While politicians from both parties increasingly saw Zionists as potential voters and donors to curry, or at least placate, the U.S. State Department opposed Zionism, believing it was counter to both U.S. interests and principles. President Taft's Secretary of State, Philander Knox, stated in 1912 that Zionism involved matters primarily related to the interests of countries other than our own. A U.S. commission that studied the situation in Palestine in 1919 concluded the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. In 1947, American statesman Dean Acheson stated that supporting Zionist objectives would, quote, imperil not only American, but all Western interests in the Near East. The Joint Chiefs of Staff reported that a Zionist proposal, quote, would prejudice United States strategic interests in the Near and Middle East, and predicted, quote, the Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations. Such memos and reports go on and on and on from the State Department, the Pentagon, and elsewhere. During this time, however, Zionists were working strenuously and ultimately successfully to combat such wise recommendations. They employed a wide range of stratagems, from open public advocacy to various covert activities. Their initiatives targeted every sector of the American population, including Jewish Americans, the large majority of whom for many decades were either non-Zionist or actively anti-Zionist, and who still today most likely are misinformed on what is being done allegedly in their name. In 1943, a Zionist organization, in the words of its leader, launched a political and public relations offensive to capture the support of congressmen, clergy, editors, professors, business, and labor. A directive ordered, quote, in every community, an American Christian Palestine Committee must be immediately organized. An annual Zionist report crowed, we reach into every department of American life. When Britain failed to accede to Zionist demands at one point, an American rabbi named Baruch Korf fomented a plan to drop incendiary bombs on London. That was only prevented when a young American aviator divulged it to the Paris police. 25 years later, Korf, his terrorist past expunged from the public memory, became close to President Richard Nixon, influencing his Middle East policies. Nixon jocularly called him my rabbi. Perhaps my most surprising discovery of so many surprising findings involves an extremely well-known and highly regarded Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis. According to a 1978 article in the respected scholarly journal American Jewish Historical Quarterly by Dr. Sarah Schmidt, an Israeli professor of Jewish history at Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and a book by Peter Gross, former editor of Foreign Affairs, diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, and associate at the JFK School of Government at Harvard. According to these sources and some others, Louis Brandeis was a leader of an elitist secret society called the Parashim, the Hebrew word for Pharisees and separate. According to Schmidt and Gross, this society promoted Zionism throughout the United States. Its initiates underwent, according to Dr. Schmidt, a solemn induction ceremony in which the inductee was told, quote, you are about to take a step which will bind you to a single cause for all your life. Until our purpose shall be accomplished, you will be fellow of a brotherhood whose bond you will regard as greater than any other in your life, dearer than that of family, of school, of nation. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis was a leader of that. Gross writes, the members set about meeting people of influence here and there casually on a friendly basis. They planted suggestions for action to further the Zionist cause. As early as 1915, Gross writes, a leader of the Parashim went around suggesting that the British might gain some benefit from a formal declaration in support of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. That sounds to many of us like the Balfour Declaration. Brandeis directed Zionist activities from his Supreme Court chambers, secretly, through his loyal lieutenants, one of whom eventually became a Supreme Court justice himself, another especially influential Supreme Court justice, Felix Frankfurter. A number of authors report that Brandeis was a close friend of President Woodrow Wilson and used his access to advocate for the Zionist cause, at times serving as a conduit between British Zionists and the president. In fact, some Zionist leaders bragged, and many British officials, high governmental officials, rightly or wrongly, believed that Zionists had played a significant role in the U.S. decision to enter World War I. Numerous individuals, both Jewish and Christian, attempted to oppose Zionist endeavors. One was Dorothy Thompson. According to the Britannica Encyclopedia, Thompson was one of the most famous journalists of the 20th century. She had graced the cover of Time magazine, had been profiled by America's top magazines, and was so well known that a Hollywood movie featuring Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy and a Broadway play starring Lauren Bacall were based on Dorothy Thompson. Thompson had been the first journalist to be expelled by Adolf Hitler and had raised the alarm against the Nazis long ahead of most other journalists. She had originally supported Zionism, but then had visited the region in person. She began to speak about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that Israel had violently forced out in its founding war to create a Jewish state on land that was already inhabited. Thompson was viciously attacked in an orchestrated campaign of what she termed career assassination and character assassination. She wrote, "It has been boundless, going into my personal life." Before long, her column and radio programs, her speaking engagements, and her family and her fame were all gone. Today, she has largely been erased from history. In the coming decades, other Americans were similarly written out of history, forced out of office, their lives and careers destroyed. History was distorted, rewritten, erased, bigotry promoted, supremacy disguised, facts replaced by fraud. Very few people know this history. The excellent books that document it are largely out of print, their facts and very existence virtually unknown to the vast majority of Americans. Instead, false theories have been promulgated, mendacious analyses promoted, chosen authors celebrated, others assigned to oblivion. George Orwell once wrote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Perhaps by rediscovering the past, we'll gain control of the present and make a better future for all our children." Thank you. I believe Scott Horton is supposed to monitor the next session, but I can introduce the first speaker. I believe it is. Okay.
Sorry, I thought we were doing questions.
Oh, I think we didn't. Oh, I forgot about the questions. I'm so sorry. We're supposed to do questions. I forgot. Please tell me when this question period's up. And I think we have people with microphones. And again, just a reminder, we need the questions to stay to 1 minute as much as possible, please. I think we have a gentleman right here. And then you'll be next. I think I see your hand next. The lady over here will be second. And someone... Oh, sorry, there's a lady in the back. Could... sir, let's have the lady in the back since she hasn't spoken yet. We'll ask the lady in the back, perhaps, since I don't think she's had a chance yet.
Thank you. My question is, with all the other things that go along the table, like resettlement, BDS, all right. My question is, with all the other things on the table, like settlements and resettlement and BDS and such, why aren't Israel's nuclear weapons on the table? On Wikipedia, Israel has between 75 and 400 nuclear weapons. That's much more than needed to demolish the world. Why aren't we pushing back on that? Why are we only threatening Iran, which doesn't even have nuclear capacity for power?
I would assume if someone wants to go into more detail, I think there are three words that I would say answers that, the Israel lobby. But maybe if somebody wants to expand on the point.
I would just say that the assumption is that the Israelis would never use them irresponsibly. It's purely a function of national defense, deterrence. The historical record shows that they have been quite aggressive in the past, but there's this assumption that they're a safe repository of nuclear weapons, and frankly, nobody wants to take that issue on because it would go nowhere. I guess that's my short answer.
My question to Professor Quigley: Can a third country petition the International Court for an opinion on the legality of the settlement? A third country, like not necessarily the Palestinian Authority, but any other country.
Another country, a court in another country. Conceivably, that could happen. It has been raised in the French courts, and actually there was a decision that was as to whether a French company that was assisting with the settlements was acting unlawfully. But with respect to the possibility of criminal prosecution, I think that's probably your question. That could occur. There are countries that do extend their criminal law to crimes against humanity and war crimes on a very broad basis, irrespective of territory. Spain and Germany have probably been the most prominent in that regard. It seems unlikely at this point that will occur. There's been pushback against those countries for doing what they have done in that regard so far in other situations. So I don't think it's likely to happen, but it very well could happen.
Hello. I have over here. I have another question for Professor Quigley. I'm over here on your left. We shared an elevator up to this morning. Paul LaRudy, and my question is about the legal status of Israel itself. That is to say that there was a partition, according to Resolution 181, which was never implemented, as I understand, and the declaration or the proclamation of the State of Israel was unilateral, and it was simply accepted. And I think this is this may be the way that states come into being anyway. But the question is, what about the requirements of the state and the borders of such a state? Because Israel has, as I understand it, never defined its borders, and it has certain obligations. Is it a legitimate state in the sense that the people of the region, including those who were expelled, have never really had any say about its existence?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I would say the short answer with respect to whether something is a state, and in particular whether Israel is a state, is whether it is accepted in the international community. And whether it has in the past committed genocide, done really horrible things, is unfair to all of its citizens, that's not really relevant to the question of whether it is or is not a state. So I think to that extent, you can say Israel is a state. You can also raise the question of self-determination and ask whether it should have been a state, which is really what you're going to. Self-determination is another issue on which I think the United States has been a bit weak. I've had to think about self-determination anew in the last few days, because in 1994 I was asked by the Clinton administration to go to a little backwater place in the southern part of Russia called Crimea and do some negotiating about the status of Crimea within Ukraine, actually. And the leadership of the Crimean Parliament pressed me on this very strongly, and they said, we should have self-determination. We should be able to decide where we want to go. And you can raise that. Certainly, coming out of the British mandate, there should have been some solution for Palestine that took into account the entirety of the population. But in a way, once the international community says a state is a state, then it is. Now, that doesn't decide the question of its borders. That question was not at all decided by the General Assembly of the United Nations.
Hello.
Thank you.
May I?
Oh, there was someone I said would ask a question. Could it be a quick one?
Jeffrey Walrow and others mentioned the 1973 Yom Kippur War. According to Seymour Hersh and others, his book, The Samson Option, Israel was prepared to use their nuclear capability when they were losing the war with Egypt until they got the U.S. to send this massive airlift of supplies, which then enabled them to win the war. But Israel was, according to reliable sources, prepared to use that nuclear capability.
Yes, that's what I found. I'm sure we both did.
Just a couple of quick points there. I don't think there was ever sort of serious preparations on Israel's part to actually use them, and we shouldn't overstate the degree to which Israel was in danger of being overrun during the '73 war. You remember that they were losing at the beginning badly in the Sinai, but that was a long way from the borders of Israel proper. And in fact, the military tide of battle actually turned before the American resupply operation took effect. The Israelis had already stopped the Egyptian advance. So one has to be a little bit careful about both attributing our intervention as having been decisive in the outcome of the war, and secondly, how close Israel was to using nuclear weapons.
Did they ever do it again? Did they ever threaten to use the atomic bombs again? Did we ever concede to them? Did we ever give them to extortion? That's extortion.
I don't believe it was extortion in '73, and I don't believe they've done that subsequently. At least I've never seen anything to suggest that. That's not why we did it.
Can I just contribute? On that point, what Steve says is absolutely right. The Egyptians made early advances because they've been rearmed with state-of-the-art Soviet weapons. So they had anti-tank and anti-air missiles that were the Israelis came at them in the '67 ways, so they lost a lot of aircraft and a lot of tanks to these better armed Egyptians. But the Egyptians had been trained in a very controlled Soviet way, where they weren't able to actually attack out from this defensive. They sort of move forward, have this screen of missiles in front. The Israelis would attack. They shoot down the planes, kill the tanks, but then they couldn't aggressively pursue into Israel because they didn't have the doctrine for that. So I would agree they were never really in danger. And the funny thing in my book, I talk about this, is that it was all a lot of theater. The Israelis claiming they were on the ropes and that they were at death's door. and that they might resort to extreme measures, nuclear weapons maybe, but everybody in Washington and in Tel Aviv knew that they really weren't. And then the Israel lobby got involved, sending Phantoms was a big deal. We were in the Vietnam War. The Phantom was a new weapon. It was a miracle weapon. It was this strike fighter that could carry 7 tons of bombs and missiles and still fly like an interceptor. So we needed everyone in Vietnam, but we ended up peeling off dozens of these and sending them to Israel at a time when, as Steve just pointed out, they were actually counterattacking and winning, and all this stuff was just gravy. So, and the lobby got involved, and it was a big sort of, Stuart Symington, the senator from McDonnell Douglas, Scoop Jackson, the senator from Boeing. They were heavily involved in these decisions to sell product from their own states. So as in most cases, a lot of this stuff was really smoke and mirrors intended to extort as much stuff from the U.S. as possible. No, I just agree that they weren't really going to use nuclear weapons.
Unfortunately, we really are on a very tight schedule, and the next panel is going to be excellent, so we'll have to go to that. But thank you, excellent questions, all of them.